video, we'll be exploring two tragic caving stories where experienced explorers found themselves trapped in ways no human body was meant to endure. The first follows a young father who became wedged upside down in a tight Utah cave, sparking one of the most intense rescue efforts in caving history. The second takes us deep into a narrow British shaft where a university student's fatal mistake turned a routine descent into a heartbreaking recovery mission. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the evening of November 24th, 2009, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, 26-year-old John Edward Jones entered Utah's Nutty Putty Cave with his younger brother Josh and a small group of friends and family. The cave was familiar to them. John had explored it as a teenager, but this visit would be his last. John was a medical student and a father to a 1-year-old daughter. His wife was expecting their second child. The group had come together for the holiday and decided to revisit the cave as a way to bond and relive old memories. Nutty Putty Cave, located west of Utah Lake, had a reputation for tight, claustrophobic passageways. It was known among local cavers for its tricky layout and dangerous squeezes. Despite its name, the rock inside wasn't soft like putty. It was hard limestone with narrow tunnels and winding vertical shafts. John wasn't an amateur. He was tall, about 6 feet, and athletic, but Nutty Putty's layout was unforgiving, especially for larger-bodied cavers. With a borrowed headlamp and a handheld flashlight in his pocket, John followed the group into the darkness. Roughly an hour into the exploration, around 8 p.m., John split off from the main group with the intention of finding a narrow passage called the Birth Canal. This passage was tight, but known among cavers as navigable with effort. But John made a wrong turn. Instead of entering the Birth Canal, he crawled into an uncharted, extremely narrow fissure. It angled sharply downward. The tunnel seemed similar at first, but quickly began to close in. He kept pushing forward inch by inch, his arms pinned to his sides, using his toes to slide deeper. At one point, he exhaled deeply to squeeze past a choke point, his chest compressing enough to gain a few more inches, but when he inhaled again, he couldn't expand his lungs fully. That was the moment he realized he was stuck. He tried to wiggle backward. Nothing. He couldn't bend his knees, his arms were pinned beneath his chest, he was upside down at a steep angle of nearly 70 degrees, with his head lower than his legs. He called out for help. Josh was nearby. He heard John's voice echoing from the depths and responded immediately, crawling in after him. When he reached the passage and saw the angle, he knew this wasn't the birth canal. It was a different section, narrower, more dangerous. Josh tried pulling John by the legs, but there was no movement. John groaned in pain. The walls were too tight, the rock too hard. John's body had essentially become a cork inside a bottle. Josh backed out and rushed for help. The first rescue call went out at 8:33 p.m. Within an hour, trained rescuers from Utah County Search and Rescue arrived. They were familiar with Nutty Putty's dangers. In fact, the cave had been temporarily closed just a few years earlier due to other rescues in tight spots. The team set up a pulley system at the cave entrance and ran hundreds of feet of rope down to John's location. Over the next several hours, they worked in shifts, trying to keep him calm while planning the extraction. But conditions were brutal. The narrow shaft meant rescuers could only reach John one at a time. The awkward, upside-down position put extreme pressure on his organs. Blood was pooling in his head and chest. He was in pain and at times delirious. They managed to briefly shift his position, relieving some pressure, and gave him fluids through an IV. John remained conscious, even joking with rescuers. But just after midnight, more than 12 hours in, a piece of the pulley system broke. The anchor in the rock snapped free, sending rescuers sliding backward and causing John to slip even deeper into the crevice by several inches. After that, his breathing became strained, his heart rate slowed. He began losing consciousness more frequently. Despite their efforts, rescuers couldn't re-establish a firm grip on him. The angle, the rock, and the depth were working against them. At approximately 11:56 p.m. on November 25th, over 24 hours after he got stuck, John Edward Jones was pronounced dead. Cause: cardiac arrest due to his inverted position. The recovery attempt was called off shortly afterward. Removing his body posed extreme danger to rescuers. After weeks of planning, the state of Utah made the decision to permanently seal the cave with his body inside. Concrete was poured into the entrance. Nutty Putty Cave was closed forever. John's death sent shockwaves through the caving and rescue communities. It highlighted how even well-prepared, experienced explorers could become victims in unforgiving environments. But his story wasn't the first of its kind. More than 50 years earlier, another young man, this time in the United Kingdom, found himself in a deadly position deep inside a cave, surrounded by rock, rope, and impossible geometry. On March 22nd, 1959, 20-year-old Neil Moss, a second-year philosophy student at Oxford University, joined a group of friends on an expedition into Peak Cavern, also also known as the Devil's Arse, in Derbyshire, England. Peak Cavern was known for its complex system of chambers and vertical shafts. Parts of it were open to the public, but other sections stretched deep into unlit, muddy passages known only to local cavers. Neil had some caving experience and had been looking forward to this trip. It was meant to be a casual exploration. He wasn't attempting anything advanced, just a descent into a newly discovered shaft that looked promising for a future mapping. But like many tragedies, it began with a simple decision that went unnoticed until it was too late. Neil volunteered to go first into the shaft. It was a narrow, vertical chimney that extended about 50 feet into the cave floor. A guide rope had been secured at the top, and he was lowered slowly down into the tight funnel-shaped space. He brought with him a rope ladder and a single lamp. The descent started smoothly. He inched his way down, communicating with his team above, but the deeper he went, the tighter the shaft became. Roughly halfway down, about 30 feet, he radioed that his arms were pinned and he couldn't move any further. His rope had twisted around his legs during the descent and became tangled. That's when the team realized he was in serious trouble. He was wedged deep in a narrowing rock funnel, his body twisted and unable to ascend on his own. The group immediately tried pulling him up, but the rope would not move. Each tug only seemed to wedge him deeper. His shoulders were pinned by the shape of the shaft, and the twisted rope around his legs made movement impossible. Help was summoned from the nearby village of Castleton. Soon after, expert cavers and members of the local rescue service began to arrive. They quickly realized that Neil was trapped in one of the tightest vertical shafts they had ever encountered. Over the next several hours, they worked non-stop to reach him. A young girl named June Bailey, only 18 years old and slim enough to fit into the shaft, was lowered down repeatedly to bring Neil food, water, and reassurance. She spoke to him, tried to untangle the rope, and even handed him oxygen, but each time she went down, she had to stop before reaching him fully. The shaft narrowed too quickly, and the air quality was rapidly dropping. They tried to widen the shaft using chisels and hammers, but each strike risked dislodging rock above him. The air inside the shaft grew worse by the hour, filled with carbon dioxide and stale moisture. Neil remained calm even as the situation worsened. He told rescuers he wasn't in pain, but was starting to feel lightheaded and having trouble staying conscious. By the second night, he had stopped responding. Rescuers made one final attempt to reach him, but the shaft was too narrow, the rock too unstable, and the air too poor. After nearly 3 days trapped underground, Neil Moss died of asphyxiation at just 20 years old of age. His father, who had been at the cave site the entire time, made a heartbreaking decision. He asked rescuers to stop further efforts. It was too dangerous to continue. The shaft was sealed with loose rocks, and a small plaque was later installed at the entrance. Neil's body remains there to this day. The incident shocked the public and the British caving community. It was one of the first widely reported caving deaths in the country. Many praised Neil's composure under pressure and the tireless efforts of the rescuers, especially the young woman who risked her life to comfort him. Together, the stories of John Edward Jones and Neil Moss, two young men, decades apart, remind us that caves are not forgiving environments. The rock doesn't care about training, intention, or character. One wrong move, one misjudged descent, and the cave takes control. If you found these stories insightful, consider subscribing for more real-life caving disasters and survival accounts. And always, always respect the cave.